What if I told you that the god everyone pictures as the devil of Greek mythology never asked for his job, never rebelled against his family, and committed fewer crimes than literally any other major god on Olympus? Hades, king of the underworld, lord of the dead. For most of us, the name alone conjures images of fire, brimstone, and malevolent scheming. We picture a villain lurking in shadows, plotting the downfall of heroes, delighting in human suffering. But here's the thing, that version of Hades, the scheming, evil overlord, he doesn't exist in Greek mythology. That character was invented thousands of years after the Greeks stopped worshipping him. The real Hades, the one the ancient Greeks actually believed in, was something else entirely. Let's start with where this whole misunderstanding comes from. If you've grown up anywhere in the Western world, you've probably absorbed a very specific image of Hades without even realizing it. Maybe it was Disney's blue-flamed, fast-talking villain from Hercules. Maybe it was a dozen fantasy novels or video games where the god of death is automatically the bad guy. Modern pop culture has essentially grafted the Christian concept of Satan onto a Greek god who had virtually nothing in common with that figure. But the ancient Greeks didn't see Hades that way, not even close. To understand Hades, you have to understand how he got his job in the first place. After the Olympians defeated the Titans in the Titanomachy, the war that established the reign of Zeus and his siblings, the three brothers drew lots to divide the cosmos. Zeus got the sky, Poseidon got the seas, and Hades drew the underworld. He didn't seize it through rebellion or treachery. He didn't scheme his way into power. He literally pulled the short straw and accepted his fate without complaint. Think about that for a moment. The god everyone calls evil inherited the least desirable job in the universe and just did it. No coup attempts, no bitter revenge plots. He took responsibility for the realm of the dead and maintained order there for eternity. So what did that job actually entail? Hades ruled the underworld, the place where every mortal soul eventually traveled after death. This wasn't hell. It wasn't a place of torture for sinners, at least not for most people. The underworld in Greek mythology was simply the afterlife, a vast, shadowy realm where the dead existed in a kind of grey, dreamlike state. There were special sections, sure, the Elysian fields for the truly heroic, Tartarus for the worst offenders, the fields of Asphodel for everyone in between. But Hades wasn't actively tormenting anyone. He was maintaining cosmic order. His job was to keep the dead in their proper place and ensure the living stayed in theirs. He was a boundary keeper, a cosmic judge, an administrator of the inevitable. When souls arrived at his gates, they were judged, not by Hades himself, but by three impartial judges, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus. Hades enforced their rulings. He maintained the natural order that kept life and death separate. And he was good at his job. Remarkably, almost suspiciously good. You know what Hades doesn't do in Greek mythology? He doesn't meddle. He doesn't descend from his realm to seduce mortal women, or start wars, or turn people into animals out of spite. He stays in his lane. He does his duty. Compare that to literally any other Olympian. Zeus, the king of the gods and supposed paragon of justice, has a mythology filled with affairs and questionable decisions. He transformed into various animals to trick people, threw lightning bolts at mortals who offended him, and punished entire cities for the actions of their rulers. His wife Hera, constantly dealing with his infidelity, spent much of her mythological existence seeking revenge on Zeus's lovers and children, people who often had little choice in their circumstances. Poseidon held grudges that lasted decades. His vendetta against Odysseus for an offense against his son went on for 10 years, preventing the hero from returning home. He caused earthquakes and storms that devastated coastal communities when he felt disrespected. Apollo challenged a satyr to a music contest and, when he won, punished him severely for the audacity of competing. Artemis transformed a hunter into a stag to be hunted by his own dogs because he accidentally saw her bathing. Dionysus had a reputation for driving people to temporary madness. Ares embodied the brutal chaos of warfare. The Olympians were temperamental, prideful, and often petty. They played with mortal lives like pieces on a game board. They demanded constant worship and reacted to the slightest offense with creative and devastating consequences. And Hades? Hades just did his job. There are remarkably few myths where Hades actively harms anyone out of spite or ego. In fact, when you look at the stories where he actually appears, he's often surprisingly reasonable. When Orpheus, the legendary musician, descended into the underworld to retrieve his deceased wife Eurydice, Hades actually listened. He was moved by Orpheus's music and his genuine love, and he agreed to let Eurydice return to the world of the living, something that fundamentally went against the natural order he was supposed to maintain. The only condition was that Orpheus couldn't look back at her until they both reached the surface. Orpheus failed that test on his own. Hades kept his word. When Heracles needed to capture Cerberus, the three-headed guard dog of the underworld, as his final labor, Hades allowed it, but only under the condition that Heracles not harm the creature. Again, Hades negotiated, set reasonable boundaries, and honored the agreement when Heracles succeeded. This doesn't sound like a villain. This sounds like the only responsible adult in a family of incredibly powerful but impulsive beings. But we can't talk about Hades without addressing the most controversial story associated with him: Persephone. The abduction of Persephone is the myth most people point to when they want to paint Hades as a villain, and it's worth examining carefully. The basic story goes like this. Persephone, daughter of Demeter, the goddess of the harvest, was gathering flowers when the earth split open. Hades emerged in his chariot, took her to the underworld to be his queen. Demeter, devastated and furious, withdrew her blessings from the earth, causing the first winter. Eventually, a compromise was reached. Persephone would spend part of the year in the underworld and part of the year above ground, which the Greeks used to explain the cycle of the seasons. Modern retellings often frame this as a straightforward kidnapping, and by our contemporary standards, it absolutely reads that way. But the ancient Greeks understood this story through a very different cultural lens, and context matters when we're trying to understand what the myth actually meant to them. First, in many versions of the myth, Zeus, Persephone's father and Hades' brother, gave Hades permission to marry Persephone. In the patriarchal structure of ancient Greek society, marriages were typically arrangements between families. From the Greek perspective, Hades wasn't defying cosmic law. He was following established protocol. The transgression wasn't the marriage itself, but that Demeter wasn't consulted, which sparked her grief and rage. Second, once Persephone is in the underworld, Hades treats her with respect. He's not depicted as cruel or tyrannical toward her. In later myths, where Persephone appears as queen of the underworld, she's powerful, commands respect, and exercises her own authority. When other heroes and gods visit the underworld, Persephone is portrayed as regal, fair, and fully in command alongside her husband. There are even interpretations of the myth that suggest Persephone ate the pomegranate seeds, the act that bound her to the underworld, with full knowledge of what it would mean. Some scholars read this as Persephone accepting her role as Queen of the Dead and the power that came with it. The Greeks weren't telling a story about a villain and a victim. They were telling a story about transformation, about the necessity of death in the cycle of life, and about the power and mystery of the underworld. Persephone's journey wasn't just a tragedy, it was an elevation. She became one of the most powerful goddesses in the entire pantheon, ruling over the realm that every soul would eventually enter. So if Hades wasn't evil, why did he develop such a dark reputation? The answer is straightforward. People feared death, and Hades ruled death. The ancient Greeks had a complex relationship with the underworld. They didn't worship Hades the way they worshipped other gods. There were very few temples dedicated to him, and people were reluctant to speak his name aloud. Instead, they used euphemisms like the Unseen One or Pluton, which meant the giver of wealth, a reference to the precious metals and fertile soil that came from beneath the earth. But he wasn't hated, he was feared in the way that death itself is feared, inevitable, absolute, and beyond negotiation. You couldn't bargain with death. You couldn't charm it, or bribe it, or seduce it. It was the one thing that came for everyone, regardless of status or virtue. That fear, over centuries and across cultural transformations, evolved into something darker. As Greek culture blended with Roman culture, and later as Christianity spread across Europe, the old gods were reinterpreted through new religious frameworks. The underworld became conflated with hell. The god of the dead became associated with devil figures. Hades, who had never rebelled against cosmic order, never delighted in suffering, never represented evil in his original mythology, was transformed into a Satan-like character simply because he ruled the place people feared most. By the time modern entertainment got its hands on Greek mythology, the transformation was complete. Hades became the default antagonist in any story that needed a god of death. Scheming, malevolent, power-hungry. Everything the original myths show, he wasn't. Here's what makes this misunderstanding so fascinating. Hades might actually be the most honorable, duty-bound figure in all of Greek mythology. He's the god who accepted a thankless position and performed it with integrity for all of eternity. He's the god who didn't interfere in mortal affairs, who kept his promises, who maintained the essential balance between life and death. He ruled over the one realm every single soul would eventually have to enter, and by all accounts, he did it fairly. And for that, history made him a villain. Maybe that reveals something important about human nature. We need villains. We need someone to blame for death, for loss, for the things we can't control or change. It's psychologically easier to imagine death as a dark figure dragging us into shadow than to accept it as a natural transition, an inevitable part of the cycle of existence. Hades was never the villain of Greek mythology. He was just the one who had to enforce the rule we hated most, that everything, eventually, comes to an end. In a pantheon full of gods who broke their promises, meddled in mortal lives for entertainment, and acted on every impulse and emotion, Hades stood apart. He was constant. He was fair. He was responsible. He did the job no one else wanted, and he did it well. The Olympians threw parties on Mount Olympus, while Hades maintained the foundation that kept the entire cosmos functioning. And somehow, he became the villain of the story. So the next time you see Hades portrayed as a scheming lord of evil in a movie, show, or video game, remember the god he actually was in the original myths, the one who drew lots and accepted his fate without complaint, the the one who ruled justly in a realm no one wanted to think about, the one who kept his word when the other Olympians broke theirs repeatedly. History chooses its villains carefully. Sometimes it chooses them simply for doing the difficult job that no one else wanted to do. Hades wasn't the villain. He never was. He was just the god who reminded everyone of the one truth they didn't want to face: that every story, no matter how grand or beautiful, eventually comes to an end. And someone has to be there when it does, to maintain order, to ensure fairness, to keep the boundary between what was and what comes next. That was Hades. Not a devil, not a villain, just a god doing an impossible job with more grace and honor than almost any other figure in Greek mythology. Maybe it's time we stopped calling him the bad guy.